Start with our acknowledgement of country. So, as members of the Charles Sturt University community, we acknowledge the words of the Wiradjuri people on whose land our university was founded and share their aspiration of Yindyamarra Wananana. They aim for us all to learn the wisdom of respectfully living well in a land worth living in. Yes. So I pay my respect to the traditional custodians of the lands where I live and work. That's the Gadigal and Birrabirragal people, and I extend that respect to any First Nations peoples present here today. Just want to make sure. Oh, thanks for whoever hit record. Yes, so my name is Casey Garrison. I'm a senior lecturer and the associate head of school for research in the School of Information and Communication Studies. I encourage you to introduce yourselves and your country or location in the chat. So yes, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you so much for coming to our third lecture in our public lecture series for our 50th years and beyond celebration of the anniversary of the School of Information and Communication Studies at Charles Sturt University. We have had a few events throughout the year to recognize our school's growth and changes from the Riverina College of Advanced Education to the Riverina Murray Institute of Higher Education in the 1970s, to the School of Information and Communication Studies at Charles Sturt University from 2001. So we're really excited to celebrate our Golden Jubilee this year and happy to welcome you here to listen to distinguished scholars in our field from across the world, like today's speaker, who we will introduce shortly. Just before we get to that, some quick housekeeping. So please stay on mute. Feel free to add your comments into the chat, but please put your questions into the Q&A, which should be accessible at the bottom of your screen. Yes, we will also be sharing the recording link to this lecture on our 6 YouTube channel later today. And as Terry noted, he's going to also share that on his podcast. So yes, with that, I'll hand over to our communications senior lecturer, Travis Holland.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this session. Our discipline of communication has a very long history here at Charles Sturt. Contentiously, we argue that we're the first communication program in the country, but there are some people up in Queensland who think that they beat us by maybe 6 months or a year. And so that becomes an ongoing debate. But we're very pleased to continue that now as part of the School of Information and Communication Studies here at Charles Sturt. And our now 54 years of history since 1971. And we're doing that today with a lecturer by Terry Flew, Professor Terry Flew, who it is my absolute pleasure to introduce. I first encountered Terry's work as an undergraduate at the University of Wollongong, where it was a very influential part of our program, and in particular, Professor Sue Turnbull, who later became my PhD supervisor, I know is a long-time colleague and sometimes collaborator of Terry's, and certainly she is somebody who highly recommends and endorses his work. As I've moved through the field in the last decade or so, Terry's work continues to influence just about everything that we do in communication, and particularly on the digital communication side of things here in Australia and beyond. Formally, Terry is the Professor of Digital Communication and Culture in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney and an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow. He's the co-director of the Centre for Artificial Intelligence, Trust and Governance at the University of Sydney, which is a flagship centre within the Sydney Law School, the Sydney Business School and the School of Architecture, Design and Planning there. He's the author of 16 books, including Regulating Platforms, Media and Democracy in Australia, Media Economics and Global Creative Industries, and has numerous influential academic publications, including book chapters, journal articles, and many more. In 2024, he commenced as an ARC Laureate Research Fellow on a 5-year project, Mediated Trust, Ideas, Interest, Institutions and Futures, which has been, I think, briefly mentioned through to the podcast that Terry runs, which is an excellent podcast which focuses on trust. I'm sure he will mention that here again today. So we welcome Terry today to talk about AI and communication, trust, ethics, justice, and policy. Professor Terry Flew, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Casey and Travis, for those very generous introductions. I should say, Travis, I was aware of your recent work through a podcast that was on Radio National talking about the science behind Jurassic Park, which was fascinating. I had a feeling it might not be 100% legit, but you explained in some detail what were the issues there. I would like to very much thank the School of Information and Communication Studies at Charles Sturt University for inviting me to be part of the 50th anniversary celebrations, although as Travis has indicated, it may be longer, of the Information and Communication Studies programs. I'd like to thank Professor Tina Dew as Head of School for extending this generous invitation to speak today. It's great to be part of a series of events that are both celebratory of the university's achievements in the information and communications fields and to provide signposts to a future located at the intersection of information, communication, people, technology, society, and psychology. I'd also like to acknowledge that Charles Sturt University is on Wiradjuri country on the land of the Three Rivers. I pay my respects to the elders of the Wiradjuri Nation. I also acknowledge the university's commitments to Yindi Amara values. Yindi Amara brings Western knowledge and Indigenous wisdom together in a voyage of discovery. The university acknowledges that with Yindi Amara, it embraces caring and stewardship for country and being good ancestors to future generations. I'm also very much aware of the rich history of the Information and Communication Studies program at CSU, with notable alumni including, and it's a very impressive list, Andrew Denton, Amanda Keller, Latika Burke, Chris Barth, Samantha Armitage, Melissa Doyle, Jessica Rowe and Hamish MacDonald, and with the ongoing work of distinguished Professor Stan Grant Jr., so prominent in Australian public discourse, there is much to celebrate. I've had it put to me by senior political figures that their first choice in hiring for their media officers are graduates of CSU. I'd also like to note the achievements of 2MCE, one of Australia's oldest community radio stations, which is about to celebrate its own 50th anniversary next year. Born out of the heady 6 months of Australia's only Department of the Media, headed by Moss Cass in the last days of the Whitlam Labor government, 2MCE is a salutary reminder of what can be achieved when reforming governments meet with grassroots activism from civil society. I've currently had the great fortune to be awarded an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellowship, and I thank the ARC for this. Established in 2009, the ARC Laureate Fellowships aim to support academics with a proven track record of leadership and innovation to build strong research teams, mentor the next generation of researchers, and undertake ambitious research programs that address significant challenges and knowledge gaps. My own ARC Laureate is on the theme of mediated trust. It responds to the challenge that has been identified by many as a crisis of trust in the institutions of liberal democracy. At the same time, the project aims to broaden the scope of trust research from its traditional groundings in philosophy, sociology, and political science by considering the implications of mediated communication, and particularly communication mediated through digital technologies, on contemporary understandings of trust. The program is focused on the intersection of what I call the three I's: ideas, interests, and institutions. It is presumed that ideas about the future, and particularly utopian and dystopian views on the potential of new digital technologies, play an important role in shaping the institutional responses to such media. At the same time, it also recognises that material interests shape these dominant discourses. Ideas matter in such debates, but so too do relations of power and the political economy of digital capitalism. As we're very much aware, when powerful people from the world's largest tech companies come to shape the dominant ideas about digital technologies, this becomes a very potent mix. The work program associated with the laureate is focused on trust in 4 domains: trust in news media, trust in digital platforms, trust in institutions, and trust in artificial intelligence. The research team is undertaking empirical work on trust across different countries in Europe, Asia, and North America, as well as in Australia, and those research findings will be made public in 2026. What we can say at this stage is that there is what may be referred to as a crisis of grievance where the distrust is less in public institutions per se, although that certainly exists, than it is in the perceived gap between the promises of such institutions and the outcomes that people perceive in their everyday lives. This generates a discontent with institutions of government and the media in particular, and it would also note trust in universities to a degree, that can turn into distrust at certain pivotal moments. According to sources such as the OECD and the Edelman Trust Barometer, trust in government in Australia sits around the average level for the 28 countries it surveys, above such countries as the US, France, Germany, and the UK, but below countries such as Sweden, Singapore, Canada, and the Netherlands. Trust in the media for Australians is among the lowest in the world, with the 2025 Edelman report finding that only 47% of Australians trusted the media, as compared to an average of 52% across the 28 countries surveyed. We also see, as I noted, distrust with universities in Australia, although this is less than distrust in government and media. There is still a respect for expertise, but is tempered by concerns that the management of Australia's universities are insufficiently focused upon questions of the public good. Recent events at several Australian universities have been corrosive of trust over recent years, although I would say also there is not the degree of polarisation that one sees in the US about attitudes to elite universities in particular. My own disciplinary background is in communication, but in saying that, I note that the question of whether communications is a discipline is itself contested. In his 2019 book, Communications, a Post-Discipline, Silvio Wasteboard has described communication scholarship as being based around, quote, a patchwork of different ontological understandings, and that what brings communication scholars together, if anything, is not immediately obvious. It obviously has its institutional apparatuses, such as professional associations, but there isn't a common underlying thread of knowledge. For Wasteboard, the 6 conceptualizations of communication are: first, as connection; second, as dialogue; third, as expression; fourth, as information; fifth, as persuasion; and sixth, as symbolic interaction. Of these, communication as connection is, I argue, a concept that can only exist when technologies of communication are explicitly foregrounded. And communications as information necessitates machines that can process and distribute information, thus leading back to questions of technology. Communication as persuasion necessarily requires consideration of the institutions that seek to persuade the public, the media and creative industries broadly defined, while communication as symbolic interaction is built upon the underlying premise that there is no social life outside of communication. Since communication is about the mediation of the interactions between social structures and everyday life, all of this draws attention to the central roles played by technologies and institutions in such mediating processes. What we can see then, I would argue, is that what constitutes the disciplinary core of communication is that the most influential definitions of the field explicitly incorporate technology, institutions, or both into their definitions. There is thus no communication outside of its interactions with technologies and institutions. And there, I think, is the conceptual core from which we can start to think about mediated trust. Thinking about communication, institutions, and technologies as being interconnected helps us to understand more clearly the nature of mediated trust. Communication at its simplest involves the interaction between a sender and a receiver of a message that is mediated through some form of technology. Yet our interactions go beyond the face-to-face, or what we might call the micro level of communication. They are situated in and through institutions and organisations, what we can refer to as the meso level of communication, and involve messages simultaneously sent to multiple receivers, what we can term the macro level of communication. So we have this interaction between the micro, meso, and macro levels of communication. There is, it has been observed, a similar dynamic to trust. Once we get beyond the micro level of what the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann referred to as familiar worlds, trust takes on an increasingly abstract character. as Luhrmann put it in his book Trust and Power, first translated into English in 1979. As the social order becomes more complex and variable, it tends overall to lose its matter-of-fact character, its taken for granted familiarity, because daily experience can envisage or recall it only in a fragmentary way. Yet the very complexity of the social order creates a greater need for coordination and hence a need to determine the future, i.e., a need for trust, a need which is now decreasingly supported by familiarity. In these circumstances, familiarity and trust must seek a new mutually stabilizing relationship which is no longer grounded in a world which is immediately experienced, assured by tradition, and close at hand. So trust is a fundamental question of modernity. When we talk about social trust, as distinct from the trustworthiness or otherwise of individuals, and there is a debate in the literature about whether or not trustworthiness is a condition of trust, we're also necessarily engaged with the meso level of institutions and the macro level of social systems. These are not analytically separate domains. Anthony Giddens observed in The Consequences of Modernity that trust in abstract systems, or the institutions of modern society, can only occur in and through what he termed the face work of those who we deal with at an everyday level as representatives of these embodied representatives of these otherwise complex and abstract entities. Digital technologies transform and disrupt these relationships in important yet paradoxical ways. Social media appears to reduce the distance between the senders and receivers of messages, which appears to reduce transparency and increase the trustworthiness of senders. Yet, the processes through which messages are received become even more opaque and filtered through the algorithmic practices of profit-oriented digital institutions. Commercial platforms have created what Nick Caldry, in his most recent book, has termed a space of the world that layers an information space upon the social world so that, as Caldry puts it, the technical properties of information space now directly affect the quality of social space, i.e., whether it feels good to live together or not. In such environments, trust struggles. We can see two clear manifestations of this. First, there is what Gil Ayel has termed in his book of the same name, the crisis of expertise. As the internet has made virtually all information publicly available to the majority of the world's population, the claims of knowledge institutions to have a unique gatekeeper function with regards to truth claims have been eroded. This can have a positive impact, let's be clear. Revelations such as the WikiLeaks files, the Snowden files, the Cambridge Analytica scandal could only play out in the manner that they did in a digitally networked environment. It's not to say that there weren't whistleblowers before the internet, there most certainly were. But what the internet enables is engagement outside of the protocols of traditional media institutions to make information publicly available that reveals the inner workings of corporate, governmental, and military power. But it's also a world in which rumour, conspiracy, misinformation, disinformation, and fake news can flourish, as the gatekeeper functions that may once have constrained such information flows have been eroded. As conventional news organisations struggle to be sustainable, facing the challenge of digital platforms to both audiences and advertising revenues, and as traditional newsrooms are downsized and the professional status of journalism downgraded, this can become a self-fulfilling doom loop. The second manifestation of the struggle of trust is anti-elite populism. As the inner workings of institutions are increasingly revealed in the digital world, and as digital users increasingly become used to an algorithmically driven social world of continuous engagement through likes, dislikes, comments, shares, threads, retweets, insert whatever your platform calls interaction. The idea that the social world should conform to the expectations of the digital world becomes stronger. In 2022, after acquiring the Twitter platform and rebranding it as X, Elon Musk repeatedly used the phrase vox populi, vox dei to describe various design decisions being made about the platform through online polls. The Latin phrase translates to, "The voice of the people is the voice of God." There is, of course, a democratic potential to populism, in that appeal to the people as the ultimate source of democratic authority presents a challenge to those elites who claim to be acting on the people's behalf. But it also has a demagogic potential in that it implies that constitutional checks and balances on power are passé in a world where the public can directly engage via social media. It is unsurprising, perhaps, that after a poll found that a clear majority of Twitter users voted for Musk to step down as Twitter CEO, Musk suggested that he would change how polling on Twitter worked so that only those who paid for Twitter's updated subscription service can vote. Soon after, the polling on X ceased. Debating the digital public sphere. Communications as a field has evolved a historic benchmark for understanding and evaluating the relationship between communications, media, and social trust. It is the concept of the public sphere, first proposed by the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas in the early 1960s. Arising out of the constitutional revolutions of late 18th and 19th century Europe, Habermas identified what he termed the politicisation of life as lying at the heart of new uses of communications media to both bring people together and to collectively organise around shared ideals, norms, and values. Such media would, of course, be central to the rise of mass political movements in the 19th and 20th centuries and instigated new modes of political communication. Habermas's idea of the public sphere has left two competing legacies. One, interestingly, points in the direction of partisan media. And with the term media, I include for these purposes cultural forms such as art and literature. Partisan media that represents organised collectivities and which is overtly normative and political in its modus operandi. Habermas is very ambivalent about this tradition, concerned that it can enable a tyranny of the majority and the subordination of the search for truth to the desire for power. There is always a tension in Habermas between his liberalism and his radicalism. In this respect, Habermas is a critical liberal, concerned to defend constitutional order and the liberal system of rights against political capture from whichever direction. The second legacy of Habermas is that of the public sphere as a relatively neutral space, providing the institutions and frameworks through which competing interests, ideas, and opinions can contend. It constitutes part of the civic spaces through which a citizenry can move towards rational decision-making through communicative action in a discourse-oriented and deliberative democracy. This has been the dominant interpretation of Habermas in the English-speaking world, squaring as it does both with the idea of public broadcasting as potentially representing all interests in a nation, but also with the idea of journalistic objectivity, with its core professional practice being the ability to separate facts and opinions. After 30 years of an evolving digital public sphere, I think we can now say with confidence that the internet and social media have been very good for the public sphere in the first sense of competing ideas and interests receiving amplification through communication, and a disaster in the second sense. Political polarisation, misinformation, and the proliferation of conspiracies and pseudo-expertise have thrived online. This has been combined with the growing crisis of sustainability for traditional news media organisations as advertising revenue disappears to the digital platforms, as well as a devaluing of journalists as the purveyors of, as President Trump has put it, fake news. Philip Schlesinger has referred to this as a post-public sphere, where new forms of news and journalism, as we have traditionally understood them, continue to operate, albeit in a weakened state, alongside global digital platforms that have become de facto gatekeepers of online knowledge, distributed through poorly understood algorithms for commercial gain. The authority of the traditional media as knowledge gatekeepers has been effectively challenged, but what exists around it is deinstitutionalised and largely unregulated. And while there is a belated push to regulate digital platforms in Australia, in Canada, the European Union, and elsewhere, although not, importantly, the United States after the re-election of President Trump. There is a struggle to identify what should be the first principles underpinning such regulation. I note here that the Australian federal government attempted on 2 occasions in 2023 to pass legislation setting rules to prohibit online misinformation, but on both occasions the legislation was abandoned as it went too far for some in inhibiting freedom of speech and not far enough for others in enabling what they considered to be objectionable speech. When facts, alternative facts, rumours and conspiracies all circulate in this informational bouillabaisse, it has become easiest to substitute power and political calculation for normative principles and the notion of a shared public interest. One outcome, as can be seen in the US, is that the defunding of public broadcasters, such as National Public Radio and the PBS, can proceed apace, as the ruling political party can conclude that such outlets are not our people. Turning now to AI and communication. Events are moving rapidly in the world of what we have come to term artificial intelligence. The AI sector worldwide is expected to grow from being worth about 250 billion in 2025 to over 1 trillion by 2032. It has also come to be at the centre of many of the major debates of our time, including geopolitical battles about which AI systems will be dominant, whether giant tech corporations have become too powerful for nation states to govern, whether these AI systems will displace creative cultural practice and knowledge work, and whether we as consumers and as citizens can differentiate between what is real and what is machine generated. As a concept, AI has a long history, and I think it's important to remind ourselves of this. Alan Turing's imitation game, developed in the 1940s, was around whether a person can accurately determine whether messages were sent by humans or machines in the absence of visual and verbal cues. The first major conference on artificial intelligence was held at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire in 1956. There have been successive waves of AI enthusiasm, particularly those of the 1960s and early 1970s, that of the 1980s, and the period from 2010 to the present. It's worth noting that there have also been what are referred to as AI winters, such as those of the late 1970s and that of the 1990s, where too much of what was promoted as AI was seen as hype that had not adequately delivered on its promises. And the AI winter of the 1990s coincided with the massive investment in the internet, seen as an alternative to the sort of investments going on in AI. What we can call AI includes quite a lot of different things. It includes machine learning, obviously, but it also includes computer vision, robotics, natural language processing, autonomous and sensor technologies, as well as what we've come to term generative AI, and most recently, synthetic AI. The surge in academic interest in AI from 2023 coincided, I would argue, with advances in generative AI. It left the science and engineering faculties once it became apparent that it enabled not only rapid information processing, but also replication of completed works that had been assumed to come from a recognisable author or creator. As one of these was very obviously the student essay, something of the Big Mac of mass higher education. This set off a plagiarism panic in the higher education sector, whose implications we're still struggling to deal with. What I would want to conclude with in this discussion are considerations of what AI means for communication. This is both in terms of how we communicate and for communications as a discipline, or perhaps a post-discipline. I noted at the beginning of this talk that one way of conceiving of communication has been involving the transmission of information. What is variously known as the Shannon and Weaver model of communication, the sender-message-receiver model, and encoding-decoding, has been premised upon the idea that humans communicate with humans with the assistance of technologies of communication, what we call media. While there can be many complexities to questions of production, reception, and interpretation, and indeed we've all taught about these, the underlying premise is that this is human-machine communication, People communicate with people, with and through machines. We've acknowledged for some time that machines can communicate with machines. The maps that navigate your driving journey would not be operable unless they did. But what AI has done has inserted machines into all dimensions of the communicative process. Messages can be sent by machines and they can be received by machines. AI not only sorts and processes information, think for instance, if you have Microsoft Outlook, how essential and non-essential emails are sorted, but creates information. And it does so not only in its own capacity, but in conversation with its users. And as those conversations evolve, as users train chatbots to better understand what it is that they want, so too does the AI-based system become a communicative partner. We often construct this around a dichotomy between the authentic and the fake. But authenticity can be, and frequently is, constructed. When the print journalist Daniel Shaw went to CBS television in the 1950s, he said to his producer, "You know, I understand print fine, but television has got me a bit puzzled. What's the secret?" And the producer said to him, "Well, the key to success on television is sincerity. And if you can fake that, you've got it made." Today's podcasters, YouTubers, influencers, and others frequently seek to bring an authenticity to their communication, which they claim to be missing from heavily produced and highly scripted professional mainstream media. Hollywood has always been in the fakery game. When King Kong climbed the Empire State Building in the movie of 1933, swatting planes while having Fay Wray in his hairy paws, what audiences were revelling in was not the realism of images of a large gorilla climbing a tall building. The history of cinema is not necessarily a search for verisimilitude, where the cinematic image increasingly converges upon the real. When Dwayne Johnson single-handedly saved San Francisco in San Andreas, and I know San Andreas 2 is coming up for release next year, the VFX is very much more convincing than King Kong, but the scenario is no less fake. With the 50th anniversary of Jaws, what we are struck by is that the suspense did not come from the sighting of the shark itself, which looked lame even by 1975 VFX standards, but by the art of Steven Spielberg in creating a scenario where the terror is imminent and with a lasting cultural legacy. Communication is going to be increasingly devolved to machines, and the decisions around when and how this happens will not necessarily be made by humans. Many have commented on the seemingly excessive politeness with which ChatGPT has been responding to user requests. My sense of this is that there's a deliberate design choice that the chatbot enables the user to continue to appear to be in command of the communications process, to be the sender of messages, even when in practice, the information itself is largely held within the software. It may be interesting as an empirical study to contrast the tone of different bots in this regard. Will an airline chatbot be more polite than one for social services? And will the airline chatbot be more polite to customers who are on its loyalty program? For communications as an academic discipline, there is need to be thinking about practices as involving people, institutions, and machines as agents. So this intersection I described at the outset of communication, institutions, and technologies. It is unclear at this stage whether we can continue to speak of media as the devices through which we communicate, and our understanding of technology certainly needs to be an expansive one, incorporating not just the devices, but the ways of knowing and technique associated with different technologies. AI developments come at a time of immense concentration of political and economic power, which challenges our capacities to set public interest criteria as signposts for the development of such systems. But we can be sure that there is going to be a lot of tinkering with these technologies, and this will provide us with new insights with implications for pedagogy, research, and creative practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Terry. There's a lot to unpack there. I wonder if anybody has any questions. None have dropped into the Q&A at this stage. But if not, I can start with one. You mentioned, of course, Elon and his taking over of X and the things that that caused. One thing that has been in flux recently is the fracturing of the ecospace. And I guess for 5 years or so, we had a kind of consolidated social media space with a couple of really dominant platforms, and Twitter had outsized influence for its overall use base. But now people have scattered to Threads and Blue Sky and other decentralized. What does that do to overall trust for institutions? Does it mean they have to work hard across all the platforms, or does it mean that the public is going to find it harder to find valuable information, across all those different spaces?
I think the second is definitely true. I might just observe at the outset that even in the era of peak Twitter, if I was to put it that way, I was a little bit of a Twitter skeptic in the sense that the user base of Twitter was always substantially smaller than that of Facebook.
Yep.
And its text-based format skewed conversation in certain ways, and it had linguistic. So I think there was always a bit of a problem in a propensity to extrapolate from what was going on Twitter, the idea of a new digital public sphere. That said, yes, for institutions, the challenges of what platforms to engage with and for whom are substantial. And I guess that for institutions, there is a degree here of having a sense of what their knowledge base, their user base is, but also where their credibility lies. Universities and TikTok, it's a difficult one. Teenage influencers and LinkedIn, likewise. So those challenges are there, but I think that fracturing of the social space is also a degree of fracturing of the informational space. I'm following with great interest at the moment some of the trends around the apparent decline of search and the bid that Perplexity may be going to make for Google Chrome. Now, search has been the backbone of Google's business model for 2 decades, and policies such as the News Media Bargaining Initiative, formerly the News Media Bargaining Code, are premised upon the idea that the content produced by professional news organisations is required for search. Now, if that information is increasingly being accessed through AI, the connections are a lot more tenuous. And one of the debates that's going on is whether users trust AI-generated results more or less than they trust search. And there's an interesting paradox here of the human dimension, that we would assume that knowing that something has been produced by a named journalist would therefore bear more trust and credibility than something artificially produced through AI, but not necessarily. Because all sorts of biases, the New York Times, blah, 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 can come into play here, whereas an AI-generated result gives the appearance of a degree of neutrality. So that's a debate that's going on. But most news organisations around the world are reporting a decline in the links that are being made through search, and this is undoubtedly connected to the increasing use of AI or information search.
Thank you. Jock Cheetham, our lecturer in journalism, has his hand up.
Hi, Terry.
Hello, Jock.
Hey, the trust issue here in Australia, well, I'm in China actually, but they're in Australia, and vis-a-vis the media, the first thing that I was wondering is, do you think that news corporations' practices in terms of political reporting have affected that trust aspect? And in asking that, I then, of course, thought about the way that the ABC has come to be pilloried from the right and the subject of conspiracy theories. So I was wondering also then how you see that piece of the Australian puzzle fitting in. And then I suppose the overarching question is, are in fact those dynamics and the way that those organisations and others influence trust and perceptions in Australia actually quite small compared to the big structural issues that are going on in Australia and globally? Are these sort of these local sort of, well, organizations and institutions and the reactions to them actually small potatoes compared to other forces? And what are those sort of, can you play out those bigger forces?
Thanks for that, Jock. There's a couple of questions there, and I think the questions went out in expanding degree of complexity, if I would say. With regards to Australian media, yeah, the distrust in Australian media is a pretty consistent trend, and the work that I've been involved with around trust in media in Australia suggests that the most trusted outlets are the ABC and SBS, but there's also a propensity to trust. The Australian Financial Review has a high level of trust. Television news has a reasonable level of trust, and it doesn't vary a lot between the commercial stations. Trust in the News Corporation tabloids lower, but there's also a factor there that general reporting on trust in tabloid media tends to be lower than that of broadsheet media. In terms of the public sphere, yes, certainly News Corporation newspapers exercise a large degree of influence in the political domain. I think the interesting question there is, though, do newspapers and their online versions continue to have the degree of sway upon the polity that they once had? And I think if you were to correlate the editorial stances of different newspapers to electoral results, you'd find quite a mixed picture there. With regards to the ABC I'd see as aiming to be the public sphere in Habermas's second conception of it. And there's the debate about public broadcasting. It actually goes back to the Glasgow Media Group and Stuart Hall around the extent to which public service media seek to constitute a political centre. And that is not so much a preference for centrist politics per se, as it is around the ways in which perceptions of journalistic objectivity, the national interest, and so forth feed into coverage. Certainly, that means that there's perpetual tension within the ABC around editorial stance, as we've seen. Larger questions around trust, I think I've sought to address those in the presentation. So I'm not really sure if I can reiterate those, other than to say, as I indicated, that proliferation of information sources does lend itself to polarisation. And it lends itself to polarisations in ways that can be hard to track because, of course, we don't receive the same media. And I think if you were to do experiments on Substack, for instance, I think you'd find there's an interesting loop in the relationship between what you access and what you start to get. This has been talked about a lot with regards to YouTube, but I think Substack would be another interesting case study there.
Thanks, Terry. Tim Koski put the hand up and then disappeared. I don't know if you wanted
to. I'm his coworker, so I can ask him directly.
No, you're perfectly welcome.
Well, I was just going to ask whether or not you felt that sometimes trust is being labeled as the issue when there's a broader issue of discontent with issues like inequality and, aging population crises and these sorts of things, whether this displeasure is sort of being delegitimized as sort of being a trust issue when actually maybe there are other issues that are behind this this unhappiness that aren't necessarily down to whether or not the media's message is being respected.
Okay, thanks, Tim, for that question. Yes, as I think you know, any metric around trust has multiple variables. That said, I think it's important to note with public discourse around trust that trust is not a newsworthy subject. Distrust is. Conspiracy theories are of great interest in ways that a grudging preparedness to go along with things is not. The philosopher Honora O'Neill has made this point in her BBC Reith lectures, that sometimes what's referred to as a crisis of trust may be a concern about legitimacy. I should say also that we need to be a little careful about conceptualizing the questions in overly abstract terms, that larger responses around trust can arise from smaller concerns about what would seem relatively operational matters. And so the quality of governance, if you like, can intersect with trust over and above great debates about constitutional authority and the legitimacy of sovereign power.
Thanks, Terry. We have a couple more people with their hands up, and that'll probably take us right up to the bells. So I might jump over to Mohammed Maki.
Thanks, Travis, and thanks, Terry, for this. This was really interesting. I've got a question that kind of related to or started with what Travis mentioned about Elon Musk and Twitter or X. And that's something sometimes I think about. And that's despite all the backlash X or Twitter received, especially after Elon Musk takeover and the algorithm things that people talk about, and even it led to many academics and many people leaving Twitter, and also the same thing with Facebook, more or less, of these, those Cambridge Analytica things, all these things. But I don't think that kind of new platforms like Blue Sky, or I don't know, even, Truth Social is new with the Trump thing, but Blue Sky, Thread, or all these new things which are coming up, have ever taken off, or they become that much popular, or still, my point is, despite all the backlash, they seem to still rule, and people still go to that sort of, legacy social media, if I might call them. Is it something to do with trust, or I don't know? What do you think is here?
Oh yeah, look, certainly in terms of Facebook, for instance, patterns in use of Facebook are driven by a lot of things other than trust in the platform. And I attended a talk last year by someone who gathers social media data, pitched at the advertising industry, and they said anyone who thinks Facebook is in decline is over extrapolating from the experience of US college students and is not paying attention to this platform as a global medium. So if your aim with the platform is to sell product, Facebook's actually still a quite effective mechanism for that. With Twitter and X, it's very striking how much official commentary still happens through X. I think if Twitter was a niche platform of one kind, X is a niche platform of a different kind, and these social media platforms are starting to look a bit like British newspapers. If you're a Daily Mail reader or a Guardian reader, there's a certain kind of set of values, assumptions, beliefs, etc., that will build around you, and maybe people, given that what users are seeking is a mix of information and affirmation. Some of that platform, mobilization around different platforms can be as much around affirmation as information. You've also had the rise of LinkedIn, the dream platform of the Human Resources Department, whose apparent dullness seems to have caused a lot of people to migrate to it. But so there you go. Yeah, I think we. I must say, I think the other thing to note here is that the publicness of social media generates its own issues, and Evgeny Morozov was talking about this with the net delusion back in 2011, which was at the high point of the idea that social media would enable mobilization for political change, that those who political change is being mobilized against can very clearly track what's going on social media. So if your purpose is to collectively organize, social media is a very mixed tool in that regard. So I hope that's useful in addressing that. I personally haven't felt that inclined to go to Blue Sky. I certainly Mastodon. I found the problem with Mastodon was it's one thing for American tech bros to design software platforms, but they tend to have a sense of how to draw a user in. I'm not so sure German engineers had quite the same degree of commercial savvy, shall we say. And I haven't felt so inclined to Blue Sky because I to be honest, I feel I can get the viewpoints of people who post on Blue Sky because they will also post to other platforms.
Thank you.
I'm off X for what it's worth. And I advise the university here to get off X as its means of publicising activities.
That's probably a good idea for anybody who wants to keep their sanity. Nilu.
Thank you, Travis. Hi, Terry, and thank you for your talk. I am a lecturer in information studies, and I want to ask a question from the perspective of my discipline. Because in information studies, we mostly focus on organizing and evaluating resources, like various types of mediums, which record the knowledge and the culture and memory. And it could be like a physical space, like a library, a digital platform, but any kind of resource, any kind of medium which they keep the information. But now with the AI age, what is best I can describe is from my students, which they mentioned they like to use AI because it gives them a direct answer rather than giving them the resources which they should go and explore. And it is very convenient, but because people want to find information as easiest ways as they can. But if the information within AI is not linked to any references, then it brings lots of questions and concerns in my field of information studies because there's no more resources which we can evaluate. And then in your talk, I hear from the communication side, as you mentioned, all of these technology, all of these medium, they used to transfer message, but now they're creating their message. So I mean, my question is, when the resources and answers, I mean, there is an answer, there is an information not linked to any resource, does it also, you think it brings lots of, I mean, questions, lots of concerns, and even in communication studies?
Yeah, I might answer that in two parts if I could. The first is around access over time to knowledge sources, and you know, I find myself thinking, well, I don't know if anyone's had this experience, but when you write things down in a notebook and you fill the notebook, do you go through a moment of thinking, well, do I keep the notebook or throw it out? Which is partly a question of, will posterity want to remember whatever it is that I wrote here? And we can certainly, think of biographies that have drawn upon the archive of documents of famous people. In the digital environment, that's not going to be stored in the same way, and the providers of the platforms have no incentive to retain any of that. So there will be some interesting questions around how we will track history. You know, when in those moments where Twitter played an important role in something, how will future generations know that happened? So that would be the first point. The digitization is tending not to lead to the preservation of resources. In Harold Innis's terms, it is very much a space binding rather than a time binding technology. In the second sense, of course, yeah, information and interpretation. I was in a discussion along these lines, and I have been in a few discussions along these lines. Is AI good or bad for the humanities? Is it, as Elon Musk posted on X last week, X no longer differentiates between researchers and engineers because everyone's an engineer? To which, when I said that, the engineer chairing the panel said, well, engineers are also researchers. So, you know, how is that playing out? But it's certainly playing out in a way that there's clearly a prioritizing there of the technical over the social, to put it mildly. At the same time, given that the same information is so readily available to so many people, it's the question of the interpretation of the information, what's done with the information, that comes to be critical. And that's actually potentially very positive for the humanities, that there is certainly an argument out there that says that it's the capacity to critically engage with information as distinct from the ability to get information that is the core skill of the immediate future. So what I do think is that it, you know, I don't think it's as bad for learning as it is for the business model of universities as they've evolved. You may know the line of the philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who welcomed AI because, of course, the students could write all their assignments using AI, and we could grade all their assignments using AI, and we can all, you know, go out in the park and talk about the meaning of life. Knowledge generation in its more traditional organic sense. You can see the appeal of that as compared to, you know, generating software to track the use of AI that will, you know, generate. You can see a back and forth of, you know, the battle. It's like one of those, you know, Godzilla versus Kong things. You know, this battle of the machines as we try and you know, scramble for some kind of foundational truth claim here. So I hope that's useful. I do know there's a couple of questions in the chat. Travis, not sure.
Yeah, no, I've seen those there. I mean, if you're happy to answer a couple more, we certainly could. I didn't want to hold people on because it was sort of advertised up until 1, but if you're welcome to, then
I'll let Tim's go, because Tim will see me in the office tomorrow. Sorry. I'll take Kurt's question there. Yeah, okay. The regulatory question. I think that you know, the geostrategic battle over AI has become very sharp. One of the first things the Trump administration did was disbanded the executive order of the Biden-Harris administration around AI safety. You know, his understanding of the US is that it is at a war with multiple fronts with China, and technology is one of those. Yeah, of course. Do tech billionaires buy Trump? Probably not. You know, I mean, Trump is very much a creature of a quite different era of power in one respect, but they certainly like the idea of a president who'll do their bidding. The question there, I think, is one around can middle powers make a difference in the AI space, or is it simply going to be a matter that is primarily the US and China, and to a lesser extent Europe. Middle powers such as Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Korea, India and others have traditionally sought multilateral solutions and have been leaders in multilateral debates. So I think part of that question, will there be effective regulation of multinational social media and AI companies? I think there's a kind of collective learning process going on, but it certainly butts up against the geopolitics of the platforms. With regards to Anish's question there, institutional distrust, populist politicians, AI generated visual, the visual dimension of persuasion has always been there, and possibly we, and I mean we sort of political researchers, if you like, underestimate it. That, you know, possibly the most effective image, well, if we go back to the 2024 US presidential election, there was the assassination attempt, but probably Trump's most effective moment was that when he was serving French fries at a Pennsylvania drive-in. It was completely on brand. It was completely inauthentic, but it everyone was in on the game of this, and it kind of put an affinity there with those who buy meals at a McDonald's drive-through, taking the bet that there are probably more of those than those who are repulsed by the idea of buying French fries at a McDonald's drive-through. But it was a wonderful moment in populist inauthenticity that played out effectively. Does that build trust? Well, it doesn't. It doesn't build trust. It probably builds a sense of the identity and the sort of we they sense, which of course is at the core of populist politics.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We've really appreciated that. Lots of insight there, and I'm sure all the people who've attended have found something to take away. And so, thank you to everyone who's come along as well. And Terry, absolutely wonderful. Catch up at Ansgar, hopefully up on the Sunshine Coast later in the year. So,
hey, thank you all very much. My pleasure. My pleasure to be here.
thanks.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Terry, and thanks, Travis. I just want to plug our final lecture in the series, which is going to be in November with Professor Gillian Oliver from Monash University, focused on archives. So if you've registered for this lecture, you'll get the link for that one, and then you'll also get the recording link for this one on the YouTube channel, and I'll send along Terry's podcast link too, so you have that one. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.